Well, hello there, and welcome to our nuanced discussion on climate change. I'm Bobby.
Hi, I'm Holly.
Hello, I'm Cailin.
Hi, I'm Vaish.
In today's episode, we will be exploring the topic of bias in climate change reporting and argue why it's important for today's media outlets to report the facts about the ever-evolving crisis. Let's start with a brief history of climate change reporting. In the 1970s, as part of the conservative war on ideas, it was launched in response to the social movements of the 1960s. And this started to have an effect on media. First, there was media outlets that were targeted through some of this conservative war on ideas. And this began to trickle into the media. In the 1990s, oil companies, fossil fuel industry trade groups, and their respective PR firms also began positioning contrarian scientists such as Willie Schoon, William Happer, and David Leggett as experts whose opinions on climate change should be considered equal and opposite to those of climate scientists. All of that resulted in a sort of balanced where media wanted to have a both sidesism, where they wanted to have both conservative talk show hosts along with fact-based finding. And what ended up resulting was a lot of the conservative misinformation that was spread by oil companies ended up going into the mainstream media outlet. Since then, in 2008 and 2010, a lot of this has been cleaned up for today. Now we don't see as much of that, but there is still some conservative media outlets doing this today. What does everybody think about that in terms
Well,
of?
that whole like not like misinformation, but the fact that it was a whole both sidesism sort of laid the groundwork for what we're dealing with now, which is that, climate change is not just about science like it should be. It's science. It's actually there's scientists, there's data, and it's not actually become about science or data. It's something that people can debate, which I think started when there was that whole let's use all this information, let's use these talking heads, let's let them on here in addition to scientists. So you're battling science with opinion, which doesn't really seem like something that a journalist should be doing.
Yeah, I agree. Somehow, climate change has been labeled as this partisan issue where liberals are for stopping climate change, and then conservatives don't say that climate change, like they say that it doesn't exist, which I think is ridiculous because obviously the data shows that climate change is a thing, and it should be something that is nonpartisan and that isn't political.
Megan Daly was saying that both sides of reporting, that shouldn't be how we should report on climate change, because it perpetuates this understanding that there's a disagreement on climate change and that there are conflicting views on what is happening in climate change. Climate change is supposed to be about facts, and that it's happening, and then we're just reporting the facts. There's only one way to go about it.
Well, and that's so interesting because I was thinking a lot in this discussion about climate change and the way that it relates to weather, and how a lot of people have been covering weather and climate change. And there's like these really interesting facts, like something like 90 or 96% of scientists believe that there's a connection between extreme weather and climate change. But this summer, when we had all of those like crazy heat waves, only 38% of broadcast and cable news segments made the connection between the weather and climate change, which I thought was really interesting. I mean, a lot of the scientists were saying this is happening. We logically know that extreme weather is related to climate change. At least all of us do. But the cable news segments weren't covering it. That most of them were just saying there's this really crazy heat, or here's a tornado somewhere where it shouldn't be, but that's okay. It just happened. We're moving on. So I found that really interesting that there's a bias in reporting the correlation between the two. Of the segments that were analyzed, so Media Matters did this analysis, and of the segments that were analyzed during the summer, only 16% of them discussed how climate-driven extreme weather affects socially marginalized communities. So they're reporting on what's happening, when they're using the science, but they're not contextualizing it, which is like such a big part of what being a journalist is. If there's anything that we've learned, it's like contextualize, contextualize, contextualize. You need to give people the background. So, I mean, I found that really interesting. What do you guys think about this whole way that the media is analyzing weather patterns and climate change?
Yeah, Holly, I think that's a really interesting point you bring up, in terms of like that low percentage of people reporting the weather and not really giving, it sounds like, viewers all the information they need as to like, why is there a tornado in this part of the country when this didn't happen 10 years ago. That kind of leads me into like another thought pattern, which would be like, what about climate change anxiety? And isn't that a thing now? And do you feel that there is a change in this recently? Do you feel like there's maybe a stronger contingent of young people or people who are coming of age now that kind of feel this?
Yeah, so in CNBC, they reported that 3/4 of their respondents who were aged 16 to 25 felt that the future was frightening due to the fact that climate change was happening. And that's about like 64% of young people that were saying that they didn't feel that their government was doing enough to avoid climate change. And even in The Guardian, they were saying that 40% of Americans in a 2020 survey done by Yale University felt disgusted or helpless about climate change. And even the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, found that more than half of respondents were extremely anxious about climate change and even having climate change guilt over the climate, things like that. And recently, President Biden, he put climate change, on the top of his list of priorities. Same with like Senator Bernie Sanders. He recently called climate change an existential threat. And even in Canada, we just had a recent election for our prime minister, and local Canadians were voting on certain issues that they wanted the leaders to discuss at the debate, and climate change anxiety and climate change was number one on the list. So it's definitely a big issue, and definitely a lot of media outlets are noticing, like for the vote. That vote was done by CBC, which is one of Canada's biggest local news agencies. And that's what is propelling forward the information to political leaders and getting what's actually important to Canadians into leaders' minds and into offices.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, those statistics about young people, it's interesting because I think the younger generation now is really the one leading the charge. So much of what you see from like the Sunrise movement, some of the people really pushing the Green New Deal are really young, and it's really encouraging to see. At the same time, they have a really good point. I mean, what happens to the Earth when they're 40, 50 years old, and how much warmer is it going to be? So that's really interesting to kind of hear those points, and to underscore that this is a real threat, especially for the younger generation.
Yeah, I'd say like one of the interesting things about climate change is that it's something that affects everyone. Like no matter what your walk of life is, no matter how old you are, no matter what your whatever political party you have. But I think we talked about, like some of the ethics behind it, but climate change affects just everyday things. Like an article by Columbia.edu talks about how global warming or climate change is creating higher bills for people with their cooling systems. So now, because people have hotter days, people are having to pay more in their electric bills. And I just think that more and more as time goes on, like increased hurricanes, earthquakes, all of these things are going to have an effect on the economy. And I think like that effect on the economy, I think is going to have people who before said, oh, climate change isn't a thing. It's going to be in their face when they see their bill, when they see their homes damaged, just different things like that. I think because of climate change, there are going to be natural disasters in places that there were never natural disasters, or there never places where there were never tornadoes. There are going to be tornadoes and hurricanes. And I think more and more like the evidence is there, but I think like we're going to be seeing the science with our own eyes, not just reading about it on an article.
Yeah, that's Cailin. I think that's a great point, and well, I think what the danger and what we're seeing now is like multiple climate disasters happening at the same time, whether you have like the wildfires in the Western United States simultaneously happening when parts of the South are flooding, or there's a tornado going through. And it's really begs a question for like United States government and policies, like how do you combat multiple climate crises at once, especially now during a pandemic? It just seems to be something that is continually getting worse. And even anecdotally, I mean, the house that I grew up in as a child never used air conditioning, never used fans. I've never used air conditioning, always used fans. Now there's one in essentially every room. And so it's just kind of, you could kind of see that change and how it's evolved over the past 20 to 30 years. And so all this kind of leads me into thinking, you know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed in these situations. And I was wondering if there's anything that we could do to kind of combat some of these things, some climate change resources that we could do in our everyday lives.
So there's some basic things that we can do in our everyday lives. There's an article I'll be talking about. It's called What You Can Do About Climate Change. It's an article from the New York Times by Josh Cass and Jennifer Daniel. And sometimes it can really just be something so simple. It can just be eating more vegetables, like red meat. And, the use of cows affects, the emissions and the air and the ozone. So just eating less meat. It's something you don't have to become a vegan, but just eating less meat, taking the bus. We know that the emissions that our cars produce affect the climate. So just not even getting rid of your car, but just sometimes going for a walk.
Mhm.
And I would say eating everything in our refrigerator, and also being aware of your lights. So your light bills, not having the lights on the time. I think there's just like simple things like that. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is that with climate change, I feel like it's also a health issue because the higher heat it affects, and then the ozone layer, we know that the ozone layer is becoming thinner. It's creating issues like asthma, coughing, chest pain, and people who suffer from asthma and lung diseases, this really affects them.
So that was our discussion today on our podcast episode regarding the bias in climate change reporting. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time.